Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's WorkSafe Tasmania Month webinar, Managing Workers with Mental Health Issues. I'm Stephanie from WorkSafe Tasmania and the coordinator of WorkSafe Tasmania Month. I'll also be your moderator for this afternoon's session as well. Before we do get started, I'd appreciate you taking a few moments to read the following slide, which just provides you with some information about the content that we will be delivering during WorkSafe Tasmania Month sessions. I'd now like to go through a few items so that you know how to participate in today's webinar. So we've taken a screenshot of an example of the attendee interface. You should see something that looks very much like this on your computer screen in the upper right corner. You're probably currently listening to your computer's default speaker system. If you prefer, however, you can hook in over the phone. Just select telephone in the audio pane and the dial-in information will be displayed. You will have the opportunity to submit text questions to today's presenter by typing your questions into the questions pane on the control panel. You may send in those questions at any time during this afternoon's presentation. We will collect your questions, and this afternoon we will be addressing all questions at the end of the presentation. We are also recording today's webinar, and we'll be making all webinars run during WorkSafe Month progressively available on the WorkSafe Tasmania site. And also, lastly, before you do leave today's webinar, you will receive a survey of the presentation, and we would appreciate you completing that survey at the end and providing us with your comments and your feedback. I'm now happy to introduce to you today Dr. Megan Woods from the University of Tasmania to present this afternoon's webinar, Managing Workers with Mental Health Issues. Welcome, Megan.
Thank you, Stephanie, and thank you everybody for being here today. I really appreciate you coming along and listening to the presentation. Are you hearing me okay? So I should first explain that I'm here presenting on behalf of my team today. So myself, Angela Martin, Sarah Dawkins and Rob Macklin are actually the team who conducted the research and developed the resources on which today's presentation is based. We are all members of the Tasmanian School of Business and Economics at the University of Tasmania, but we're also members of the UTAS Work, Health and Wellbeing Network, which is a cross-institutional network of academics led by Angela Martin and Christy Sanderson, who share a common interest in the ways in which work, health and wellbeing interact together. So, in today's session, what I would like to take you through is a process model that we've developed to explain a process for supervising an employee with a mental health issue. And to illustrate that process, I'm going to use the fictional case study of John the bank teller and Claire, his manager. In this process, I'll also be referring to the case study that Stephanie circulated for you before today's session, and there's also a fact sheet that goes with that that has some additional information I'll be referring to today. I'll finish up the session by reviewing some resources that we found useful for developing the presentation and that you might find useful in supporting your managers and employees through a process like this. So, as you all noted in your pre-seminar survey responses, there are many ways that we can think of mental health and understand mental health. So in today's session, when I refer to mental health, I'm referring to that sense of well-being and the psychological resources that we use in life as the basis for our feelings of self-esteem and a sense of mastery over ourselves and our environment, and also those that we use to develop and maintain our social relationships and the environment in which we find ourselves. In everyday English, we usually use the phrase mental illness to refer to a range of different conditions such as depression, bipolar disorder, anxiety or schizophrenia. In today's session and in our work, we prefer to use the term mental health issue rather than mental illness because we find it a more inclusive and less stigmatising term, and also because we're trying to differentiate between the psychological condition that a person might have, for instance, depression or anxiety, and when it's actually an issue for them in their life and in their workplace. So first, let me give you the context for what I'm going to be talking you through today. In today's society, managers are increasingly likely to supervise an employee with a mental health issue sometime in their career. Incident statistics for conditions like depression and anxiety: at any given time, 1 in 5 people will be experiencing a mental health condition, and across lifetime incidence for depression is 1 in 5, which means over the course of our lifetime, 1 in 5 of us will experience depression at some point. Research also shows us, for instance, study by Shan and colleagues, that nearly 70% of managers have worked with or managed an employee with a mental health condition. And we recognise that this statistic is probably underreported when we consider that approximately 50% of people who have mental health conditions don't seek professional help and deal with them as a private issue without other people necessarily being aware that they have a condition or how it's affecting their life. Research also shows us that managers feel underconfident and inadequately prepared to handle this situation should they find themselves in it. For instance, research by Martin and colleagues showed that of the managers surveyed, 74% perceived that working with depressed employees was stressful, and only 25% of those managers reported that they had received any training about mental health in their workplace. This begs the question then, how can we better prepare and support managers to deal with this job demand if and when they face it? To find out, we conducted an interview study of 24 managers who had personally supervised an employee with depression or burnout to find out what they did actually experience in this situation and how it played out for them. We were also interested to know how did they actually find this experience when they went through it. So we were interested to know not just what was challenging or negative about this, but what might also be positive and rewarding about going through this kind of situation. The findings from that research form the basis of the process model I'll present today. We developed this further when we were awarded a grant by the Australia and New Zealand Academy of Management to develop some resources for teaching MBA students about managing mental health in the workplace. Those resources included the case study on John and Claire that we'll be looking at today. So the process that I'll be outlining for you today involves 4 stages. Firstly, becoming aware of the employee's mental health issue, then investigating what the issue is and the implications that it has for the organisation. Thirdly, developing and implementing an initial response plan to reasonably accommodate the employee's situation. And I'll finish by talking about some considerations specific to managing the employee's mental health issue as an ongoing situation. And as I go through each stage, I'll also be speaking about some specific issues and considerations that inform each one. So stage 1 is when managers first become aware or start to suspect that their employee may have a mental health issue which is affecting their workplace and their workplace behaviour. For the managers we interviewed, this generally occurred by the manager observing changes in the employee that led the manager to suspect that something was up, and more specifically, when an employee's behaviour in the workplace changed or caused the manager to open a conversation about what was occurring. And quite commonly in that conversation, the employee then disclosed that there was a mental health issue in play. Occasionally, employees did disclose this unprompted. They just came out and told their manager, look, I've been diagnosed with depression or I have an anxiety disorder. But in most cases, this occurred in the context of a conversation about observed changes in the way that the employee was behaving in the workplace, in their mood, their way of interacting with other people, or because the manager had just observed several indications that the employee basically wasn't themselves right now. They were behaving in ways that were unusual for that person, and so the manager opened up a conversation about that to say, look, this is what I've observed, can we talk about what's going on? So one important consideration in stage 1 is the way in which that conversation is handled, both as a way to investigate what might be going on with that employee and also as a way to open a conversation or doorway with that person that you can go through again in the future. So in either case, the original approach to the conversation can be handled the same way as any other performance management or feedback conversation. I've noticed that you are behaving like this. I've noticed that this is happening, and use that as a way to open the conversation. The second important consideration is that in this situation, particularly when discussing performance-related issues, managers need to be aware that the employee could disclose a mental health issue in the course of this conversation. So they need to be prepared for that eventuality and able to handle it should it come up. For instance, the employee could disclose that they do have a diagnosed mental health condition. Or it may be that in the course of that conversation they agree that something is wrong, but they don't know what it is. Our research certainly suggests that in this situation, managers should not try and broach with the employee or suggest to the employee that they might have a mental health issue. But they could inquire as to whether or not the employee has spoken to the doctor about their situation or how they're feeling, which can then be a way to explore that further in the conversation. So in the case of John, our bank teller, if we have a look at the information in part 1 of the case study that tells us how John has been behaving in his workplace lately and what's been going on for him, we can see several indications that John could be experiencing a mental health issue. Some of the red flags here might include the fact that John's mood and manner have changed quite a lot in recent times. So he's become flat rather than upbeat. He used to be a very energised and enthusiastic person, but now he lacks energy. He's lost interest in activities that he used to enjoy, including aspects of his job that he used to find very rewarding and interesting. In terms of changes in the way John's behaving in his workplace, we can see evidence that he's finding it difficult to concentrate and make decisions. He seems to be getting more distracted and more often getting lost in what he's doing. He used to previously rely a lot on his own judgment to handle problems and take decisions, but more and more these days he's deferring to his manager to check in about what he should be doing or seek guidance as to what he should be doing, which suggests that confidence in his own judgment is waning. The case also tells us there was a recent incident in which he was snapping at colleagues or involved in a conflict situation with his employees. And again, the key indicator here is that this is atypical behaviour for this isn't how John has previously been behaving in his workplace, but something has changed now, and it's the reason for those changes that Claire is interested to investigate. So in stage 2, the focus is investigating the employee's mental health issue and its implications for the organisation so that appropriate workplace accommodations and support can be worked out. Our research and the anecdotal evidence, including your survey responses, suggests that this is the stage where managers feel underconfident about handling. And one of the common concerns here is, well, I don't feel it's appropriate for me to be discussing someone's mental health with them. I am not a psychologist. I'm not a psychiatrist. I'm not a doctor. So when I refer here to determining what the mental health issue is, I'm not in any way suggesting that it's appropriate for a manager to try and diagnose that situation themselves. What I mean here is determining whether the employee has discussed their situation with their GP or another healthcare provider and whether a mental health issue has been considered or diagnosed. And we would recommend phrasing it in just that way. So not at this point trying to determine that the employee has clinical depression or whether they have an anxiety disorder. We're referring specifically to figuring out, has anybody looked at this as a potential cause for this person's behaviour? More specifically, has somebody with the relevant professional knowledge looked into this? A related point here is figuring out who is currently involved in the employee's situation. For instance, is their GP aware of their situation and providing support? Do they have a counsellor or a psychologist that is supporting them or has them under treatment at the moment? And at the same time, knowing not just who is supporting, but what kind of support are they getting. For instance, are they taking medication? Are they involved in counselling support? Have they perhaps been trying different treatments in the past and their treatment program is about to change? Managers can also feel like in this situation they're straying into or intruding into people's personal lives when they're asking about mental health issues. The key test here for maintaining boundaries and professional boundaries here in this conversation is focusing on the workplace implications. And that can be as simple as saying to the employee, look, I don't want your private life here. I just need to understand how we could adjust things here to support you. Some managers have said that in this situation, having a basic knowledge about common forms of mental health issues and their symptoms helped them understand what their employee was talking about. Others said they took the direct approach and said to their employee, for instance, I don't know what it's like to have depression. Can you tell me a little bit about it so I understand how it makes you feel and how it affects you? And we would suggest that even when managers do have a good background knowledge about mental health issues, this is still a very beneficial approach to take. There are several specific benefits that we see here. One is that it stops managers making assumptions about what it is like for this person to be experiencing this particular mental health issue. They may, for instance, already know something about depression, but they're still not going to know what it's like for this particular person to be experiencing depression right now. So asking them straight up, what is it like for you? How does it make you feel? How does that affect you? Does stop the manager from making assumptions and help them understand the specific case of this particular person and what they're experiencing right now. But it also helps the employee feel heard and listened to, helps them feel like their manager actually cares about them as an individual and is interested in their individual case. But some of the managers we spoke to also told us, well, opening the conversation this way then gave us some conversational openings for future discussions about this. So for instance, when I asked my employee, how does your depression affect you? They told me the kind of symptoms that they commonly experience. And so when later on I observed that they were experiencing the same kind of symptoms again, that gave me a chance to go and talk to them and say, hey, I've noticed that that seems to have come back for you. How are you? Are you all right? Is there anything we need to discuss? But it also then meant that they could use that as an opportunity to build their own knowledge about mental health issues and create more of a dialogue with their employee about these issues. So if we consider, for example, how this might play out for John, we can see, beg your pardon, minor tech issue here. Then in John's case, Claire has determined that John has been diagnosed with clinical depression, that his GP and his counsellor are both involved in his care, and that he is currently being treated with a combination of medication and counselling approaches. The main impacts in terms of affecting John in his workplace and the impact on the bank have been on John's ability to focus and concentrate, his ability to handle complex issues, and as well as deal with the demands of interacting with customers and colleagues. So in this situation, we need to balance out the support that John needs, but also ensure that the bank's operational needs can be met as well. In this situation, we've determined that John, for instance, is having difficulty handling the complex international banking cases that he's currently working on, but it's not an option to take John out of those negotiations because he's the person in the organisation that knows the most about them. So he actually has unique knowledge and expertise that the bank really needs to be able to use here. It's simply not an option to say to John, okay, have a couple of months off and don't do anything while you deal with this issue in your life. There must be some way to figure out an approach where the bank can still get access to the expertise it needs and John can get the support that he needs as well. We notice also in the case that there is an existing tension between John and his team members Chris and Simon due to the incident that happened in the first stage of the case study. So one of the issues that Claire would want to explore here as she's talking to John about his needs and what support he might need is to determine what is the current state of play around that issue. Has John, for instance, gone back and spoken to Chris and Simon about that incident since it happened? Is he going to need to do that, or might Claire have to actually intervene and speak to them as part of resolving this issue? Stage 3 refers to developing some initial responses for supporting the employee in the workplace and providing reasonable accommodations to accommodate their ability to do their job. The Disability Discrimination Act says, for instance, that employers are required to make reasonable adjustments to meet needs of employees with the mental health condition. So to determine what reasonable adjustments would be, we'd first need to determine the core requirements of the job, including the knowledge and skills that are required to perform it, and then determine which specific elements are being affected by the mental health issue, so that we can determine which elements need to be adjusted and how they can be accommodated. We also need to consider other support needs that can be met through the workplace. For instance, a significant body of research has shown that being able to work and be in a workplace environment is a really powerful influence on people's ability to cope with and recover from mental health issues. This is especially important for conditions like depression and anxiety, which can cause people to withdraw socially, because then work becomes a really important mechanism for accessing social support and feeling like they can still maintain their regular life and lifestyle while they're dealing with their mental health issue. At this stage, it's also important to consider how other people in the organisation are going to be informed about what's occurring and any adjustments that are going to be made. The most important consideration here is whether or not the employee is willing for others to know about their specific condition or not. If not, it's possible to explain the situation using more general phrases like the person's dealing with some personal matters right now, or they're dealing with a health issue. But privacy legislation says that the specific details of an employee's mental health condition cannot be disclosed to other organisational members without the employee's consent, unless there is a safety risk to other workers if that was not known. So generally speaking, unless the employee says that you can tell other organisational members that they have depression or they have anxiety or whatever the issue is, without that explicit consent, it can't be mentioned. So the manager would need to find other ways to explain to people what is occurring and why that is the case. In John's case, for instance, we can see that his key issues around being able to focus and concentrate and being able to handle conversations and discussions of complex needs are probably the core components that are being affected by his mental health issue, and therefore the ones for which accommodations are needed. But we can also see there's a couple of other issues in play here. For instance, the medication that he's on is causing headaches and nausea, and the benzodiazepine is causing specific issues in the morning because of how his medication affects him. But we can see from the case that John has some other needs that might need support and accommodation here. We can see from the case information, for instance, that John is really quite anxious about how his situation is affecting him and how it's affecting his performance. So, as I mentioned earlier, if Claire turned around and said, for instance, okay, John, let's put you on leave for a month and see how you go, give you some time and space to deal with this issue and then come back to the workplace later, that could actually be unhelpful for John in this situation, because it could actually result in John feeling even more anxious about letting people down, about what could happen to these international banking cases if he's no longer involved, and also anxious about potentially losing his job if people at the bank feel like he's not able to handle his responsibilities. But we can see from the case that John also has some other support needs that could be accommodated here, such as his need to attend counselling sessions during work hours, protecting his privacy and his confidentiality about his depression, but also the need to manage John's exposure to triggers, such as situations in which he feels challenged or overwhelmed by what's going on around him. So, as with accommodations for a physical health issue, developing a response plan means considering a range of options and evaluating how well they will meet the employee's needs and the organisation's needs in the short term and the long term. It also needs to include a plan for reviewing the arrangements to see how well they're working and when adjustments might be necessary, just as we would with a return to work plan for somebody who's returning to the workplace with a physical injury or illness. In this instance, the communication strategy means not just how to explain to co-workers and team members what is occurring, but also documentation of the plan that's been developed, including documenting any advice or recommendations that have been provided by other professionals involved in the situation, such as the employee's GP or counsellor. This is important to fulfil legislative requirements for making reasonable adjustments and also for helping employees adjust to new expectations. So having a clearly documented plan which outlays what the employee will be doing over the next few weeks or months, and by extension what they won't be doing, what they're not responsible for and don't need to take care of, can also be very helpful in helping employees adjust their own expectations of what they should be trying to do and how they should be trying to do it, and make sure that everybody is literally working off the same page in their understanding of what's happening. So in John's case, Claire was able to determine that just giving John a period on leave was not actually going to meet his needs or the bank's needs. So John's plan instead focused on supporting him in work. For instance, changing his work hours to accommodate his attendance at counselling and the effects of his medication, giving him more administrative support so he did not feel overwhelmed and so that he had somebody had his back to check details and arrangements for him, make sure he didn't miss anything important. And in that plan, there are strategies for reviewing the new arrangements, including a plan for the first few weeks while John is on the benzodiazepine, and having weekly meetings with Claire to confer about his work and how the new arrangements are going. We know in this particular instance, Claire told the rest of John's team that he was being redeployed for a special project related to international banking, as a way of explaining why he was being temporarily relieved of dealing with customers and telling transactions and would be working in a less customer-oriented environment. Now in stage 4, I'm referring to the additional actions and considerations that are related to the ongoing supervision of the employee situation. And here I'm changing focus to focus specifically on the demands on the manager as they provide ongoing supervision for their employee, and some of the supports and strategies that managers may need in this situation. We were surprised to find that ours was one of only 5 studies that have actually ever been conducted to look at what managers experience in this situation, and ours was the only one that specifically examined what managers actually went through and needed when supervising an employee with a mental health issue. The managers we spoke to told us that one of the biggest challenges they faced was managing the boundary of their relationship with their employee and knowing where to draw the line between sympathising and wanting to support their employee as a person, but also balancing that with what they felt they could or should do as a manager dealing with a staff member. For instance, some managers reported feeling very challenged to know how much leeway they could give the employee on performance issues or how long they could let that employee have, quote, special arrangements, unquote. And unfortunately, in many cases, this feeling of being challenged or out of their depth was exacerbated by the fact that their organisations either didn't have policies and procedures to guide them, or if they did exist, the managers weren't aware of them and weren't able to access them. And so they felt very much like they were having to work these things out on their own without any guidance or support. And some of them even said to us, well, you know, I also felt challenged here because not knowing very much about mental health issues, I didn't know whether what I was working out for the employee was actually going to be helpful and was appropriate. So I felt like I was really out of my depth on that one. But another major challenge we identified was managing the impact of the situation on the manager as a person and how they personally dealt with the demands of this situation. So some managers did report that yes, it was very draining for them, and as one manager said, oh yeah, there were some days I came home and just cried in the shower because the whole thing was very challenging for me. I felt so sorry for this person and it was very difficult to see them suffering and going through a really difficult time. Another manager said they recognised it was particularly challenging for them to deal with this kind of situation because as one manager said, well, you know, I'm the manager. I'm supposed to be the person that can fix it for my staff. And this was a situation that I couldn't fix. I could help, but I couldn't fix it. And again, the challenges with that also arose here to do with having to communicate with other organisational members about the employee situation, especially when other members of the work group or the work team were coming to the manager and saying, well, how long are these new arrangements going to be in place? You know, if I am, for instance, doing all my own admin work right now because the person who normally does that isn't available, well, how much longer am I going to need to be doing my own admin work? Is this going to go on for much longer, or is something else going to be done? So to guide considerations of these issues, we've drawn from what's called the theory of preventative stress management. And that theory says that we can manage stress in one of three distinct ways. The first is at the primary level, by reducing or eliminating the stressor, which is causing the stress reaction in the first place. The second is then dealing with the stress as it arises. And at the tertiary level, we refer to supports and strategies for dealing with stress once it's being experienced. So in the case of the managers we spoke to, a primary level response might be reducing or eliminating some of the stresses associated with feeling challenged or out of their depth by providing more clearly defined boundaries around what they are responsible for and what they're not, what they're expected to take responsibility for and what they're not, and where the organisation has any policy or procedural guidance for them in terms of how they should handle these issues. At a secondary level, we might look at providing more assistance to managers to help them develop coping strategies, for instance, when they are for dealing with stress when they're in the work environment versus what they deal with at home, and different strategies they can use to access that. At a tertiary level, we might look at strategies for providing support to their manager if and when they do find that they themselves are becoming stressed for dealing with this situation or feel like they need some more support themselves. So, in the case of John and Claire, support strategies might include negotiating boundaries with John as to when she's available to support him and when she is off duty. So the case refers, for instance, to the fact that John has taken to calling Claire and discussing his situation with her, and sometimes those calls occur outside of work hours. So a strategy here might be that Claire has a conversation with John around the times that it's okay for him to call and that she's able to support him, and what boundaries they might set around that by saying, for instance, she can call him during work hours or up till 6 p.m, but he's not to call her after that time. That might also include strategies to arrange for him to have somebody else to talk to other than Claire, maybe so that he has someone to talk to when Claire is off duty, but also to share the care, so to speak, so that Claire is not the only person that he's relying on support in his workplace. It may be, for instance, that somebody else to talk to is someone in the workplace that John feels comfortable with, or it might be a personal supporter, such as a friend or a family member that he can call when he's feeling anxious or upset or needs to talk, rather than calling Claire. Another strategy here would be giving Claire someone to talk to, such as access to the HR manager or to the bank's employee assistance program, so that she has an opportunity to debrief, and also so that she has someone who could advise her about how to help John appropriately. For instance, if Claire had access to the HR manager and that was someone she could go to for guidance and support, the HR manager could then help Claire clarify what she actually is and is not responsible for in supporting John, where she can draw lines and expectations for herself, and could also help her by, for instance, helping her role-play conversations she's going to have with John so that she feels better prepared to have them. So if, for instance, Claire's a bit nervous about saying to John, it's not okay for you to call me at home in the evening, she might want to go and role-play that conversation with the HR manager first so that she can practice some different ways of making her point or having that conversation, deal with different responses she might think she'll get from John, so that she's got some strategies in place to deal with those if and when they actually arise in the conversation. Giving Claire somebody to talk to, it also gives the organisation an opportunity to determine how well it is actually helping its managers and employees in this kind of situation. So, for instance, if Claire, in conversation with the HR manager, identifies that one of the challenges she has is she doesn't know what she can actually do for John or what degree of latitude she has to relax his roles and responsibilities, then that could provide some useful feedback to the bank's human resource managers to say, well, this is an area where our managers have needs that we aren't supporting as well as we perhaps could be. There's an opportunity for us to build our organisational capability in supporting people with this and improve our own capacity to support our staff in this way. Other strategies for Claire might include helping her develop strategies for managing her own stress responses and how she deals with those. So, for instance, if Claire normally deals with stress in her workday by coming home and taking her dog for a walk at the beach, then maybe her strategy in this situation could be to make sure she schedules a couple of extra beach walks with the dog while she's supporting John, so that she's got extra opportunities to use that as a debriefing and a stress relieving technique. And again, some strategies for helping manage the ongoing relationships with other team members. So the case tells us, for instance, that because John's colleagues were initially told that he was being redeployed for a special project, some of those employees have now complained that they were not offered the same opportunity to work on the special project. So one strategy here might be for Claire to come clean, so to speak, and explain to the rest of the team that John has actually been redeployed into different duties while he deals with some personal issues, and just say to people, look, we originally said it was so that he could work on another project because we were wanting to protect John's privacy. So I hope that the model that I've provided today gives you some ideas for ways in which you could support your own managers and employees when they are dealing with mental health issues, and perhaps also as a starting point for having some more conversations about this in your own organisational environment. I'd like to finish by pointing you in the direction of some resources that we've found very helpful, and hopefully you will too. Some of the resources here, specifically the ones from Heads Up, you may have previously seen on the Beyond Blue website, as Heads Up is now the mechanism that Beyond Blue use to provide resources and tools specifically for creating mentally healthy workplaces. But in addition to the resources we have here, there are also some that have been developed and used by members of our team, such as, for instance, the Australian Human Rights Commission Guide to a Practical Guide for Managers for Workers with Mental Health Issue, and also the Guide from Mental Health First Aid England, a line manager's resource for managing and supporting people with mental health problems in the workplace. If you'd like any further details about the research that I've alluded to today, the details are provided here, but you're very welcome to get in touch and we can provide copies of those for you. There are two other resources that you're very welcome to access if you would find them helpful. One is the Business in Mind DVD and Resource Kit that was developed by Angela Martin and Sarah Dawkins as a workplace mental health promotion program specifically designed for small to medium enterprise owners and managers. Copies of the DVD and Resource Kit are still available from Angela and Sarah, even though that project has finished. So if you would find that helpful for your own organisation, please get in touch. The other resource that you're very welcome to access is a study that we're doing, which is just about to start, which is pilot testing a brief 3-hour intervention designed to develop psychological capital in teams. So if your organisation would like to participate, you would just nominate someone to complete a 3-hour Train the Trainer workshop in which they learn how to deliver the team-based intervention. They then deliver it to teams in your organisation, and the teams participate in some evaluation research there. I mention this specifically because the Train the Trainer workshop is actually being held in Hobart in 2 weeks on Friday the 16th of October. So if you're interested to learn more about this, please get in touch and we'll let you know more about the study and how you can participate if you would like to. Now Stephanie, I see that leaves us with about 20 minutes for questions. So if we have any, or if there's anything people would like to ask extra questions about or ask for extra comments, happy to take any you have.
All right, no, thank you very much for that, Megan. And yes, as you mentioned, we'll start going through any of the questions that were submitted during your presentation. So just a reminder, we haven't finished the webinar yet. So if anyone does have any questions they would like to submit, then please do type those questions into the question panel on the side. So one question that did, or comment that did come in, says the HR community has been looking at this issue as well.
Mhm.
HR professionals are often the ones left to deal with difficult situations without support.
Yes, and if I'm honest, that's the next piece of research that we would love to have a look at, because we've heard so much from this study and others we've done about how line managers have felt challenged in this space. And we know anecdotally that it is often the human resources managers who are, I guess, caught as the meat in the sandwich in many respects, because on the one hand, they are the people who are in the position to support both the employees and the line managers as they deal with this issue, but often they are the go-to person that managers come to say, how should I handle this issue? So from the feedback we've had is that in a lot of instances, HR managers do feel themselves like they are also left in a space where they have to be able to provide guidance and support to others, but then also obviously make sure that organisational needs are met as well. It'd be really interesting if anybody has any questions or comments about any issues they feel particularly challenged by, or that they've identified from their own experience that I perhaps didn't touch on so much today.
Thank you, Megan. Another question, what is the likelihood of returning a person to work who has been off work due to a MHI for an extended period? What are some of the strategies to do this?
Well, I'd say as with someone returning to work from a physical illness or a long-term physical condition, the first and most important thing to do there is talk to the professionals that are supporting that person to see what would be an appropriate way to support them back into the workplace. Even with conditions like depression and anxiety, which are quite common in the population, as I touched on, the way in which they're experienced and the consequences they have differ for different individuals. So one person who has been off work for a long time with depression might come back to work able to do certain things or do them in certain ways, but somebody else who's had depression for equally as long might not be able to do the same things or do them in the same ways. So I would say the place to start there is always by talking to the people who are professionally supporting that person, if the employee is open to that, or to the extent that that's possible. So talking to their GP, talking to their counsellor, seeing how they themselves feel about what they're capable of returning to work to do. And when those discussions have identified that there are some opportunities, for instance, there may be some particular roles or tasks that the person feels better able to deal with in the first instance, then you develop a return to work plan to give them a guided transition into that, but also making sure that there are appropriate checkpoints along the way to see whether in fact they are coping with that situation as well as they'd hoped. They may be coping with it better than they anticipated. But in any case, it's important to make sure that that's a phased process and that there are plenty of checkpoints along the way to make sure that the employee feels like they're well supported, managers feel like they know what's going on, and that the treating professionals have also got an opportunity to be involved in the supervision of this process.
Thank you, Megan. Another question, can you please repeat about the research study information that you were talking about?
Oh, sure. So the original study was an interview study with 24 managers who had personally supervised an employee with depression or burnout. So we went to managers who had actually experienced this themselves at some point in their career and said, okay, tell us what it was like for you. And in that sense, the interview questions followed the same basic process that we discussed here. So how did you first become aware of the employee's issue? What happened? So how did that situation then play out? And we also asked some questions around what they found negative or challenging in that experience, and also what they found positive and rewarding in that experience. And then we looked at the insights from all of those interviews, did an inductive analysis of the different kinds of things that managers were saying, and some of the conclusions from that research informed the model that I discussed here today. If you're interested in more of the details of that study, you're also very welcome to look them up in the paper by Martin, Woods and Dawkins. If anybody would like copies of that paper, please feel free to contact me on my UTAS email address, and we're happy to send a copy out to you.
Thank you. Another question, is this advice in line with return to work requirements?
I'm not entirely sure of the question. Are you asking, are we advocating that you should follow return to work processes? Was the question, are there specific return to work requirements if it's a mental health issue?
That's basically all I've been given. Is this advice in line with return to work requirements?
Well, certainly, to the best of our knowledge, it is. So we were careful to develop the advice in the slides based on the information that we have. But if anybody's aware of more recent requirements that aren't reflected in the slides, or if they're aware of some they think maybe aren't cognizant with this advice, please let us know.
Question, what do you do with a customer services officer when, sorry, there are not really non-customer service roles available?
Okay, so I'm guessing that in that situation, if you had a customer service employee who perhaps can't at the moment deal with some of the demands of a customer service role, but you don't necessarily have other opportunities available to offer them at the moment, well, I'd say it would come back to the process that I outlined in stage 3 about figuring out, well, what are the core requirements of this job and how can they be reasonably accommodated for this employee. So if they find, for instance, that they aren't coping very well with dealing with customers, a busy customer service environment, then perhaps one option would be to schedule them to work at a time which is less busy and then less demanding. If the bigger question was whether or not they could deal with working in a customer service role at all in light of their mental health issue, then that would come back to the same process of saying, are they actually able to meet the core requirements of the job right now? If not, do they need to be redeployed to deal with other tasks and responsibilities? Or if they really can't deal with those roles and responsibilities, might there be other options that we need to explore?
Okay. Now another question, did managers talk about the managing the cost of managing staff with MHI and how they dealt with that, for example, having to put on more staff?
They did. We didn't get people talking specifics about how they handled that. They raised it more in the context of the challenges that then created for them. So some did say, for instance, you know, our initial response was to give the person a reprieve from dealing with their customer service responsibilities, but then over time, you know, our ability to cope with them being absent from the team became difficult, or we couldn't access sufficient resources to cover their absence longer term, so then we had to go back and review that. So while they didn't talk about that in terms of giving us specific details, they certainly did acknowledge that as a challenge, and many of them also touched on that in the context of saying that was where we really felt challenged to know how far we could go and basically how long we could have special arrangements in place for someone, particularly when that did start to have implications for things like if we were redeploying staff to deal with this person's absence and that put more demand on the team in other ways, or we had to bring other employees in to train them up to do parts of the person's job, which then affected their availability to do other things. So they certainly did acknowledge that that was a challenge. How they dealt with it and how much of a challenge it was also affected by the kind of organisation that they're in. So one manager did say to us, we actually couldn't do anything for the employee because we're a small organisation, we didn't have any resource slack to provide them with alternative duties or to cover them in their absence, and so we were very constrained in what we could do. So we're aware also that when people are needing to handle this differently when they're in smaller organisations versus larger organisations. But it's interesting to note too that it worked the other way, that sometimes people said, well, because it was a smaller organisation or a smaller team, yes, there was more impact on the group. Everybody knew what was happening, and at certain times everybody did have to basically roll up their sleeves and dig in to help us support this person, and particularly to cover their absence. But that also also meant that everybody was involved, and a couple of the managers said to us, actually that fostered a really nice experience for the team to say, well, this is who we are as a group of people, we want to support this person and help them. And some of the team members also took out of that the fact that, oh, well, the team dug in and helped that person, so should it be me that needs help next time, I feel confident that I'll get that kind of support too. So on the one hand, we had the trade-off for the operational needs and the costs and the resource demands of supporting, but also sometimes a payoff for the team and the organisation as well in some quite unexpected ways.
Thank you, Megan. You mentioned, I guess, earlier in your presentation about needing to get permission from, I guess, the individual before any information about their mental health is disclosed. Do you need to get permission from the person before speaking to a GP or a counsellor?
Yes, my understanding is that they have to give permission for you to talk to their treating professional. So you can't just, for instance, ring them up and say, I understand that you're currently treating Megan Woods for depression. The employee has to give permission for that, and also to be sure that and obviously be aware that the professional is going to be limited in what they can say as well, in terms of how much detail they can go into about what they're helping the employee to deal with.
Okay. Another question. What would your advice be to a manager where the team member will not discuss their situation, but they are clearly unwell, and this is increasingly impacting on their work performance and the other team members?
My advice would be that in that situation, you have to handle it as you would handle any other performance management problem. So even if you suspect that there is or you even know that there's a mental health issue in play, if the key issue is that the person's behaviour in the workplace is causing a performance problem for the organisation and for the team, then you have to approach that the same as you would handle any other performance management problem, which may include, as I touched on earlier, creating a conversational opportunity for the person to disclose that there is a mental health issue in play, or that that's why they're doing what they're doing. But at the end of the day, the same issues apply. If it's an issue in the workplace, it needs to be dealt with as a workplace issue, so that if, however the issue plays out, the organisation and the managers involved are also protected in being able to demonstrate that they've done everything they can to investigate the issue and develop some appropriate responses, so that if it does come to a time where, for instance, that becomes an issue for the person's continuing employment in the organisation, that you can also show that you have taken all reasonable steps to accommodate that and that the situation has become untenable.
Thank you. Can you just run through the training event that you mentioned on the 16th of October, Megan?
Yes, sure. Okay. So this particular study is being done to pilot test an intervention which has been designed to develop the psychological capital of work teams. Psychological is a concept that we use in a fair bit of our work, and it contains 4 components: self-efficacy, resilience, hope, and optimism. So this particular intervention has been developed to try and build the psychological capital that's held by members of a team and across a whole team. And so to participate in that study, or organisations that want to participate in that study, simply need to nominate somebody to come along to the Train the Trainer workshop in 2 weeks to learn how to deliver the particular intervention that's been developed for this project. They will then, once they complete that training, go back to their organisations and train teams in their organisations using the protocol that they'll be taught at the workshop, and then they'll participate in some evaluation research around that. So if you'd like to know more about that, Sarah Dawkins is actually leading that particular study. You can contact her through her UTAS email or the UTAS website, and she'd be more than happy to talk more specifically about what that involves and what the processes will be in a couple of weeks for the Train the Trainer workshop.
Thank you, Megan. Another question: what would be deemed legally reasonable adjustments and a timeline for this type of support?
Okay, well again there we draw on the guidance from people like Comcare and what's provided for return to work plans. So in terms of what's legally defensible, I would say that the person to talk to there would be one of the lawyers in your organisation, or to talk to somebody like Comcare to say, how can we be sure that we've made reasonable adjustments here and that we've met the letter of the legislation. But certainly we think that the processes that are detailed for physical return to work plans are very helpful here in terms specifically of setting up some timeframes for a phased transition back into the workplace. And it depends also if we're talking about a situation where an employee has been off work for a period of time. Perhaps they've taken a couple of weeks off work while they adjust to their medication and they're now coming back to work after that period, or where they've been off work for a much longer period. So again, as with a physical return to work, you would have discussions around what's happening in, say, their first week back at work, their first couple of weeks, their first month, their first couple of months, including some time frames for review to checkpoints along the way. So we'd say that's certainly a good starting point for looking at somebody returning from a mental health issue as well. But again, I'd say it depends also on what is the context for them being off work and coming back into work. So we would say always include some provisions for what's happening over the next, say, 2 to 4 weeks, but then also some provisions for what's happening over the next 2 to 3 months as well, including check-ins and progress, checking in on progress along the way.
Okay, another question. What does the research identify as good practice for resilience in workplaces? In other words, what work habits, organisational practice builds employee resilience?
Good gracious, that could be a topic for a seminar all by itself. And certainly one that I'd love to go into, but bearing in mind that we've only got a couple of minutes left, I'll just say that if you would like to have a look at the Work Health and Wellness Network webpage, on the UTAS webpage, you'll see that we've got some links to some of the work that we've done there. But this is also work that we're continuing to do. So if you'd like to contact me by email through my UTAS email address, whoever sent that question in, I'm more than happy to point you in the direction of some other resources that you could have a look at there.
Okay, we'll just run through this. Megan mentioned we've almost to the cusp of the final moments of the webinar. We'll just run through the final questions from anyone who was wanting to send Megan in any other questions. More than happy for you to contact her directly at UTAS. So another question here, are we able to locate an employee to another site where they may be able to be given less customer service work if they're not willing to try this? I think that might refer to the previous question.
If I take that question to mean we've determined that we could provide better support to an employee if they were working from a different work location, but they maybe don't want to move to that alternative work location, then I think there it comes down to what you can demonstrate is a reasonable adjustment for the workplace to make, but also a reasonable adjustment for the employee to make. So in that situation, if you could show, for instance, that the only way you could provide that degree of support to the employee was if they worked at the other location, then that would be a different negotiation than saying, well, we can do it, because you would then need to show that you really can't provide that degree of support in the location that they're in now. Then it comes down to being able to determine what is reasonable for both parties in terms of how far the workplace arrangements can really be adjusted. But if the employee turned around and said, well, I literally can't work in that alternative location because, for instance, it's 2 hours away from the location where I currently work and that's an untenable situation for me, then that would reopen the conversation about how far can we reasonably accommodate the employee's situation and where might we need to draw the line on that.
Okay, just the last couple of questions. One of the challenges is getting people to take ownership for their own issues. In the example provided, John sought professional help, which made the management,
Yep.
apologies, which which made the management of the issue easier. Which action must the organisation take to ensure they've done everything practical if a person will not engage in helping themselves?
So I'm going to take that question to mean if in our scenario Claire had said to John, you know, how are you feeling? Are you all right? And John had said, look, there's nothing wrong with me. You know, that was just my colleagues being unreasonable in the bank that day, and that's why I yelled at them. Then I would say, as I said earlier, that in this situation you can encourage people to seek help from their GP or other forms of professional support. But if it comes down to there being some kind of incident in the workplace, as in the case where there was the incident between John and Chris and Simon, then it comes down to handling that as a performance-related issue and saying, is there some reason for this performance? So if in that instance the manager has said to the employee, you know, have you discussed your situation with your GP? Have you gotten any help with this? And they've said no, because there's nothing wrong with me and I'm fine. Then the manager has to take that at face value. So if the employee says no, there's nothing to look into here, there's no issue to be addressed, then the manager has to proceed as if there's not and treat it as a performance management issue.
Okay, and final question for this afternoon's webinar. Is it possible to determine if the MHI, for example, depression, is caused by work issues, and can this lead to workers' compensation claims?
Yes, it will to determine that it's due to workplace conditions, or certainly that it may be exacerbated by workplace conditions. So you'll see, for instance, on the fact sheet that I handed out, under the Workplace Health and Safety Act, there's a provision that employers are responsible for providing a safe and healthy workplace that does not cause mental health conditions or aggravate any existing mental health conditions. So yes, there is certainly a requirement that workplaces can demonstrate that they have not contributed to a to a mental health issue or exacerbated it, which would then also come down to doing things, looking at job analysis and job conditions to see whether there were any stressors that might have affected the employee's situation, or stressors that could have exacerbated a situation that was already in play. So, for instance, at a recent seminar I attended, one of the workplace health and safety officers who worked for a natural resources company talked about the fact that turns out they had an employee on staff who had a profound anxiety disorder, which the organisation had inadvertently exacerbated by sending him away to work on remote work sites where he was 8 hours drive from the nearest people and had no contact, and nobody at the worksite had contact with anyone outside the worksite for the whole time they were there. So a gentleman who turned out to have an anxiety disorder was put in a work situation where for up to 4 weeks at a time he had no phone, no internet, no access to his family and friends, no access to any of his supporters, and working in that very isolated and unsupportive psychosocial work environment then really exacerbated his anxiety disorder and led to him having a major episode. And the workplace health and safety officer said, yeah, and unfortunately, you know, once he had an episode and we realised he was in trouble, we did everything we could to get him out of that situation and get him to some support. But unfortunately, that meant that we also booked him flights that meant he was sitting by himself alone in an airport for 3 hours waiting for his plane, with an awful lot of time in his own head to think about what was going on and all of the things that he was worried about. So in that situation, the organisation didn't know beforehand that this individual had an issue, but once they knew, they also unfortunately could see that they had contributed to some of the distress that he was experiencing by the way they had managed his work arrangements. So that's always an issue that comes into play, both in terms of supporting people here, and if there are contributing factors, then yes, those would certainly have a bearing on things like workers' compensation and insurance.
Well, thank you very much, Megan, for delivering a very engaging webinar this afternoon. Just just on the resources that you did touch on, for example, the Business in Mind CD, what's the best way that people can get that information?
If you email me at my UTAS email, I can either respond myself or I can forward your message through to the people that were responsible for that program, and they can send a copy out for you.
All right, great. Again, thank you, Megan, and thank you everyone for attending this afternoon's webinar. Again, we are recording today's presentation and will progressively get those webinars up onto the WorkSafe Tasmania website after WorkSafe Month. Also, once you leave today's webinar, please stay on your computer screens for a little bit longer. You will receive a survey on the presentation, so we will appreciate you taking a little bit of time to complete that feedback and providing us with your comments. So on behalf of WorkSafe Tasmania and our presenter today, Dr. Megan Woods from the University of Tasmania, thank you everyone for joining us, and have a great rest of the day. Thank you.